We're thinking about what vital congregations have in common. What are the traits or behaviors we look to see when we set them side by side as a group? What are the characteristics we notice in them that may be lacking in congregations that are struggling? Well, one thing we've noticed has to do with leadership. So that's our focus for this conversation. Let me tell you a story. When I was graduating from seminary, I filled out the paperwork to start what we call the search and call process. And among the questions was a place for you to select the preferred regions of the country where you might like to serve. Well, I indicated that Indiana was one of the regions of our church where I might like to work. Since the seminary was in Indianapolis, and that was also the location of the regional minister of Indiana, sort of the closest thing we have to a bishop in our tradition, I was invited to have dinner at his home. It was a lovely evening. It featured great food, good conversation throughout, and well, because I've never been accused of being the brightest bulb in the box, it wasn't until the last question of the evening was asked, as we were finishing our dessert, that I realized that I was being interviewed. It wasn't so much about whether or not I wanted to work in Indiana, but whether the regional minister wanted me to work in Indiana. Here was the question. Tell me about your stewardship and the practice of generosity. Well, after a long, uncomfortable silence, I said, well, I'm a student and my church pays me $65 a week. It's a little hard to think about stewardship and giving when you're living on macaroni and cheese at 5 boxes for $1. He smiled, paused, nodded his head a little bit, and then after a moment said, well, I think you should know that my wife and I have been in the top 10 giving units of every church I've ever pastored, even though we've never been in the top 10 income earning units of any church I've led. You'll be graduating soon and be going to a new church where you'll get paid better. And after you get settled and learn about the community and its people, if you're fortunate, God's going to give you a vision, a sense of mission that your church can accomplish. And it's going to take money to do it. Like it or not, he said, you're going to have to inspire people to give. And you can't do that if you don't give yourself. People can tell whether you're all in or just putting in your time. You can't ask for money with any integrity if you don't give any yourself. Well, I was convicted and feeling pretty guilty, but this is where his grace as a leader came in. He certainly didn't demand that I leave that evening a committed tither. Instead, he said, I want to encourage you to grow toward the tithe, to do it as you're able, to grow 1%, 3%, 2.5%, 4%, however you can. Kind of use that Pauline language of giving as you are prospered. And he said, I believe you'll discover that the tithe is the floor, not the ceiling of generous giving. I also believe you'll discover what my wife and I have learned, that there is great joy in giving to things you believe in, things that you know make a difference. My guess is that you won't stop growing when you reach the tithe. Well, he was right. And he taught me something about leading that night that I didn't know despite having an undergraduate degree in business with a focus on management. Leaders set the tone. I can remember my dad saying when I was growing up that you lead by example. Well, nowadays we would talk about the culture that leaders create, the way they embody the organization's values and how their behavior establishes expectations for everyone who's a part of the team or the company. And it's no different in the church. Leadership matters, especially when it comes to setting the tone in giving and generosity. Because if the leader doesn't get it, well, the congregation doesn't have much of a chance. So I'll tell you what I did when I got to my first church after seminary, which wasn't in Indiana, by the way. I met with the elders and we talked about the tithe and we talked about my personal challenge and struggle to grow in my giving. It was an enlightening conversation, not just for me, but for the elders themselves. Some talked about their own giving and why they tithed and where and when they learned that discipline. Others listened intently to people talk about things I don't think they'd ever considered. There was a general consensus during the meeting that We should encourage each other and seek to support the work the church was doing and encourage others to do the same. Not surprisingly, the church did grow. Numbers in worship did increase, as did our connections in the community, which led to new areas of mission and service, and most important, we had the resources we needed to do the things we felt God was calling us to do. Something similar happened in the next church I was called to. By then we were already tithing and looking to grow beyond the tithe, a difficult challenge with 3 kids heading toward college. So I shared my story with the elders in the same way, the process of growth and what it meant to us. And again, the elders shared their own stories of how they'd come to be generous and why practicing generosity was so important to them. And again, some in the room looked a bit amazed at people they thought they knew who were doing things that had never really occurred to them before. Again, a shared commitment was made by the group to grow in our giving and to encourage others to do the same. And as we began to push it out in concentric circles like pebbles thrown into a pond, from the elders to the elected leaders to the diaconate to the mission team leaders, and it continued until it extended its reach well into the congregation. It was kind of contagious. And it wasn't me. It was shared leadership around a common belief that what we were engaged in was changing us and in some way the world around us, that it made a difference. So what is it that congregations that have a sense of vitality share in common? Well, that's the question we're considering, and we're not the first to ask the question. Much of what we'll be exploring in the next several installations of this series have been inspired by the work of the Reverend Dr. Barbara Fullerton and research she did in the United Church of Canada, along with some consideration of Cliff Christopher's book, Rich Church, Poor Church, and of course our own encounters with dozens of congregation, clergy, and church leaders, all of which has recently found confirmation in the National Study of Congregations Economic Practice conducted by Indiana University's School of Philanthropy and the Lake Institute. Now, remember, our particular focus is the area of financial stewardship, looking at congregations that have enough resources to carry out their mission and ministry, regardless of their size, geographical location, demographic makeup, etc. But I say this so that you'll understand this isn't just the musings of some guy in his basement with a camera in front of a green screen, which we've turned black, but is rather grounded in experience and confirmed by academic research. So what do we know so far? Well, we know that leadership is key. It's foundational to a congregation's ultimate success. Leaders lead with passion and conviction. Leaders lead not with do as I say, but with do as I do, modeling the behavior they want to see in others by letting others see it in themselves first. Leaders are accountable. Leaders teach others what they know. They mentor. Leaders show up and invest in relationships. Leaders work shoulder to shoulder in serving with others. Leaders are trusted because they do what they say they will do and their words are consistent with their actions. Leaders are invested. They give of themselves and their resources because they believe in the organization and its mission. They seek to embody its values and its mission. They're all in. Let me tell you one more story. If you've ever served on a nonprofit board, you know that a 100% response from the board is expected when it comes to the annual fund. Nothing less will do, because granting agencies who fund these organizations always ask for that figure of board participation in the annual fund, because if the members of the board aren't willing to support it, why should they grant it any money? So imagine for a minute the kind of strong leadership in your church if it could say, before you ever ask for a nickel of support from the congregation, that the leadership is all in, 100%. Everyone's made a commitment, and now we're inviting you to join us. If you're wanting to take the measure of your church and its vitality, start with your leaders, and that begins with your pastor. In our next segment, we'll talk about vision. For the Center for Faith and Giving, I'm Bruce Barkauer. Would you like your church to reach its full giving potential? Contact us about Generosity Plus, consulting and coaching for congregations just like yours.